Hello everyone, welcome to Class 9 for Effects PhD's The Craft of Grading 2. I'm your instructor, Mike Matusik. So in Class 9 here, I thought it'd be fun to throw it out to the members in the forums with any suggestions about some topics for Class 9, if there was anything that you guys think would be fun to go over. Since Class 10 will be more of a review of some of the submissions for the challenge, I got some good response. The first one I'm going to go over in Class 9 here is from Peppo, who mentioned that in all the previous classes, a lot of the footage I've been working with has been of higher quality, well shot, and which is a big part of the equation of a good color correction is starting with really nice footage. You know, sometimes, for example, when you see a commercial or a film that has these beautiful blue skies, sometimes maybe the sky was just blue and it was just enhanced a little bit. But if it was a gray overcast day, to kind of artificially put a blue sky in there is never going to look right. It's not going to look as nice as if it was just naturally that way. So it's kind of the same thing. You know, when something's shot really well, it's going to make the colors look good. So he mentioned having a troubled shot and how I would tackle that, because a lot of times, actually more times than not, you're going to see a troubled shot, and how Colors deals with it is pretty important. So the first shot was actually provided by Peppo. He got permission from the filmmakers to be able to use this shot. So obviously some of the issues with this shot is it's a little underexposed, the color temperature is a little out of whack, and it's a little soft and noisy. So it's a great example to use as an example in this class. So the first thing I would wonder about this shot would be context, where this happens to fall within the commercial or the film. And a lot of times, like, this could be a fluorescent-y warm scene, and maybe that greenish cast is appropriate. But since I don't know the context of this shot, I'm gonna just try to make it as beautiful and balanced as I can. So the first thing I'm going to tackle here is the color balance of this scene, and a great tool to use for color balance would be the gain. The reason you probably wouldn't want to use gamma is because that'll affect the blacks, and in this particular shot, the blacks seem to be fairly neutral, so I'm going to go after the color balance with the gain control. And just to show you, if you bring up your waveform monitor, you can see that the blue channel is pretty compressed, and the red is pretty high. So we're going to want to kind of pull those in sync a little bit better to get a better balance. So I'll take my gain and just work the color balance. And again, it's going to be, now that I'm pulling some essentially blue, pulling yellow away, you can see there's a lot of blue that's kind of infecting the rest of the image. So now I'm going to go back to my blacks and pull a little blue out of there, and it'll be helpful to do put a little contrast in there. So, and again, this is on my base layer in my stack, in my Baselight stack. So I'm not going to want to clip or crush anything. I just want to get a general sense of more balance, and pulling some of that kind of, you can see her skin tones are pretty red, the wall's pretty yellowy green. So just by pulling some yellow out of the highlights with the gain, the color temperature is starting to go a little bit more natural. And now I'm pulling a little green yellow out of the midtones. The blacks are going a little pinky magenta, and some vector scopes have a little crosshair right in the dead center, or a little box. Baselight scopes don't. And it seems like a small thing, like these, if you can see my cursor, this little like square box here on the red, sometimes there's a little box in the center, and that can be helpful actually with color balance. So you can see this little trace is actually kind of shift a little bit up to the right towards magenta, and let's pull that down a little bit. And so if I take my black control and kind of pull it down a little towards green, you can kind of see it be more centered. And as small of a move as that may seem, the vector scope can actually be a nice tool to help balance a shot that's quite a bit out of balance, or even a subtle thing. If you're looking at your image and it just subtly feels kind of greenish or red or magenta, check your scope, check your vector scope or your waveform, and if something seems a little bit skewed, and it can help be a little clue. And so anyway, so this is in my Baselight stack called my base. So now that's feeding into my look layer, where I'll dial in a little bit more contrast, and it's a much better starting point than here. So I'll go to my look layer, and then I'll bring the blacks down a little bit, push up the whites, and again, this is just me trying to make the image a little bit more, just a little prettier, and again, with no context for exactly what the appropriate look should be for this scene. And go a little desat a little bit, and so now I'm just building up contrast a little bit. And again, an underexposed scene that you add contrast to is going to actually enhance noise. So actually, if I play through this shot, you'll be able to see that it's quite a bit noisy. So we'll tackle that in a little bit here. So now I got a little contrast dialed in, and so the next thing I want to do is this. Now that she feels somewhat balanced, the blacks feel somewhat balanced. When you got a few elements that feel correct to you, like the skin tones feels like it's in a little better place, the blacks feel in a better place compared to here. But now that wall feels very green. The shadows in the wall are kind of green, the back wall is kind of green, so I'm just going to throw in a secondary here, and I'm actually going to reference in my secondary, my D key, I'm going to reference the base layer because it's a better balance. And you could probably spend hours trying to just balance this scene to look perfect just with lift gamma gain, but using a secondary kill vector or Q angle, whatever your system calls it, is a nice quick way to make it further enhance the color balance of the scene. So now I have the background with a decent isolation. It's picking up a little bit of her eyes and under her eyebrows, but there's actually some green there anyway, so if I just desaturate it, you can look how bad that looks. So we're going to keep a little bit of the warmth in there because it's obviously a warmer scene, a warmer wall. But so I'm just going to take the gamma within that isolation and just skew it a little bit away from green, and you can see how it kind of cleans up those shadows. And you can even do a little desaturation, but just A, B. Just a little bit, just pulling a little of that green out goes a long way to making the scene feel a little more balanced. I mean, overall, it's a warm scene. There's not a lot of variance, but you're starting to see it feel a lot nicer. So now we're feeling pretty good, but now I think what's bothering me a lot is the noise of the image. So, and again, we're enhancing that because we're adding contrast. You can see in the original it's there, but it's not quite as apparent or as annoying as it is here. So a typical comment from a client would be, oh, I never noticed that film grain, or I never noticed that noise before. And that's probably because, one, they didn't see it on a good monitor, and then two is because when you're color correcting and you're enhancing the image, you're also enhancing the noise. That's just what happens. So, so most color correctors will have a noise reduction feature, and typically it's processor intensive, unless anybody out there has an old digital vision noise reducer, which is real time, but most of those are, I guess, boat anchors at this point in the workstation-based world that we're in now. But I actually already kind of set my settings in Baselight's noise reduction, and it'll soften it quite a bit. So it's typically made for grain reduction for film scenes or subtle kind of low frequency noise and digital sensors. You know, this has got a lot more stuff going on. There's a lot of like vertical kind of noise going on and chunkier grain. I don't know if this was a kind of a standard def PAL or something up-resed shot, or it was shot, I don't know if it was 1280 or what it was, but it definitely has some chunky grain noise in there. So this is kind of me A/B in the noise reduction. Baselight has a grain reduction feature called temporal degrain, and it's a temporal-based noise reduction. And so you may have a spatial noise reduction in your system, and that'll just look within the frame itself. It does a good job. It won't leave any motion artifacts, but it also softens the image quite a bit because it just looks within the one frame and softens what it thinks is noise. So the best type of noise reduction is actually temporal, or temporal, as the friends in the UK like to say. So it will look at adjacent frames for, it's looking for grain or noise that isn't there on one frame but is there on another, so it knows that's noise, and it'll remove that with a temporal algorithm. So then there's different parameters in there. I won't necessarily go over exactly what each one does because every system is completely different. And but it does have they call it flow radius, which I have at a fairly modest setting, but that tries to minimize the rubber face artifacting, which is the motion artifacting you'll see in grain reduction. But in this shot is so noisy from here to here, but you can see it does a pretty good job on the background, because it's not moving, but her head's kind of whipping around, so it's much more complex to reduce the grain there. So you can kind of see, as they say, rubber face, because it's kind of like morphing around because it's a temporal grain reduction. So, but it's decent. It's not awful. I could play with the settings, but that's something to play with. And so I have that after my color correction, the look layer. And so now, Baselight has a nice feature where it's a cache strips, because grain reduction is so processor intensive. There's a button for caching out to a certain layer, and then anything on top of that, it's based on the cache. So it's not having to reprocess or re-render any of that previous render. So I'm going to add a second color correction. It's called Look To layer here. And so here I can push more contrast in there if I want to. I can further take out some warmth, because as you pull out warmth, it looks good to your eye when you pull it out, but then a few minutes later you look at the image kind of with a fresh eye and you're like, whoa, there's still a lot of warmth in there. And it's a common thing with color correction. It's always good to take a step away from the image and look at it with a fresh eye. So I'm just, again, taking a little warmth out of there. And I'll leave it to you guys to finesse your noise reduction, but this shot definitely needs it if you're going to pop the contrast. I could a little. So just kind of building the vignetting there. I'm not going to go too crazy, but my eye was kind of going to the left side of the frame. So. And what else can we do? So now the next thing, it's a little soft, and whether that's from any type of up-res or soft focus, what I would recommend is, I don't want to sharpen any noise in any parts of the image. So I'm just going to put a shape on her, and I just want to sharpen up her eyes and some of the details in her face. And that'll kind of give the illusion of sharper focus. And I'd still probably want to work on some grain reduction because it still looks a little funky, but it, compared to where we were, I think we're worlds apart. So I think it's in a good spot. And then I'll just kind of, I played with this shot earlier, so I'll just kind of, I'll save this. This is my real-time pass, but here's what I did prior to recording the class here. And it's just, I went with a little warm. You can see my skin tones here are still a little greenish in the shadows. So before I add a little bit more rosiness to her skin tone, and I took a little bit more green out of the background. So I think my past self was more talented than my current self, but But I think this image can look pretty good. So it's just a matter, again, context. If this was a moodier scene, I wouldn't have had to push it quite as far. The noise wouldn't be as big of an issue. And I like to think every shot is somewhat salvageable. It depends on time and I guess money and patience and client's patience. But spend some time with any shot, and you can get it into a decent spot. And these are the type of shots that leave impressions on clients. It's the sometimes pretty footage is going to look pretty before and after color correction, and shots that need a little bit more love, like this shot, can really be impressive to a client and can really save their rear end, so to speak. So there, I think that was a great example. I thank Peppo again for providing the footage and for posing the question of working on shots that are a little bit more in the troubled world. So again, thank you to Peppo. So for our next question, Ali had asked about an ACES workflow for, or also ACES acronym there. So a workflow for Baselight or specifically Resolve. And I think for the scope of this class and for it being more of a application agnostic type class, I think that might be a little bit beyond the scope of it. And also me personally, since that particular workflow is still kind of evolving, it definitely is more appropriate for a high-end feature workflow. And for the market I'm in, which typically is more independent features and commercial work, that particular workflow may not be as applied or common for a few more years. So I would think I'll probably post in the forum some information on that on the web that you can look for. So look for that. And another question that Ali had was in regards to a color grading environment or how to set up a color room properly. And what I would recommend would be, first off, would be a calibrated monitor. And there's some nice ones out there. Obviously the Sony, the new Sony OLED monitor is really nice. But obviously that's $12,000. You can get. I color right now on a TV Logic. We're actually ordering a Sony. It'll be here in a few weeks. But that it's great if you can afford a nice monitor like that, and if you can, that I assume you're at a higher end facility. But if you're not, I think that's okay. There's obviously plenty of scopes out there to get your monitors in a decent balance. On monitors, I have an iMac next to my $10,000 broadcast monitor that I work on, and those are US dollars for everybody out there. But the iMac screen is just, it's a 3-year-old, 2-year-old iMac, but it's not close, or it's not perfect to the broadcast monitor. That's a higher quality panel, but it's actually not bad. So I guess my point is that you can get a prosumer panel, whether LCD, OLED, well, there's not much OLED out there, but backlit LED monitors, or a plasma. A lot of color off of the Panasonic line of plasmas, which are pretty nice. But so, long story short, having a calibrated monitor is the most important factor. And whether it's you having a probe, trying to color it, there's stories of having 8 different probes, and each probe has a different result. So, how to test that probe or trust that probe is kind of difficult. I would say if you could hire a professional to come in that engineers facilities that can give you a little bit more input and calibrate, I would recommend doing that. But that's number one, is a calibrated display. I'm a big fan of external scopes, which is nice. That's not married to your system and taking up GUI space. We work on a leader scope. And so having an external scope is nice because the way you can position it in your line of sight, it's nice too. The way I have it set up is I have my broadcast monitor in front of me and my GUI up to the right. Then it's probably like a 10-inch LCD with my output of my waveform and vector scope is nice because I can just quickly look at it, and it's a black and white type display. It similarly resembles the old CRT leader scopes or Tektronix, I believe. And again, that could just be my old schoolness in there, but it's nice to have a separate display because sometimes if your system is crashed or buggy and the scopes they're a little bit of a lag, could be kind of annoying. So having an external scope to kind of reference is nice. Lighting environment is important. You know, some colorists, facility engineers like to have the D65, kind of a daylight balanced environment. The theory behind that is that it kind of color balances your eyes, so there's kind of a consistency there. Sometimes if you're staring at a warm light, say you come in from outside in the sun, your eyes take a while to adjust, so the daylight D65 lighting in a room can help offset that. But some people's argument is your living room is lit with incandescent lighting, and it doesn't really matter as much. There's never been any like extreme tests done whether one way or the other is better, but just you don't want a bright window next to your grading station. You don't want to be necessarily, if you're in a DI theater, it's pretty much pitch black, but sometimes it's nice to put up some ambient light and look at it on a monitor. So just keeping in mind, just have some type of thought process behind the lighting. You don't have to fit to any formula. It also depends on where your clients are, whether they're in front of you and behind you. So when you're setting up a room, do you want to be behind the clients, off to the side, in front? Traditionally, the colorist has been in front, clients behind, sometimes raised up on a platform. So the lighting is going to affect that. You don't want any glares in the colorist's eyes or in the client's eyes. So it's a very broad topic, but I would just suggest if there's facilities that you can visit, just check them out. Go online, do a Google search for color rooms and just kind of see what you like. But it's really the shape of your room, the preference of where you want your clients to sit. But there's honestly, it's like anything, there's no de facto standard for how to light the color room, or how to lay out the color room. It's very colorist preference or facility engineer preference. But calibrated display, adequate lighting, no huge bright glares on anything, and comfortable seating. And so I think the main point too is you spend some money on a properly lit room, calibrated monitor. You also just want to make sure technically your workflow, what you see on your monitor and what you render out, depending on what flavor of codec or format, whatever you lay off to tape or you render out as data, make sure that matches your calibrated monitor, because at the end of the day, if what you're looking at isn't what the client gets, it's kind of all pointless to have a nice environment to color correct in. So great. So thanks, Ali, for that question. And so our final question comes from Phoenix, who asks, he just wants a primer on what makes the video look video-ish and the film look filmic. He goes on to say, what steps do we need to take to make the video-ish shot look a bit higher quality? So that is a very interesting question. So that is a very common thing. I want it to look more filmic, and that's kind of, that request in the color suite has kind of taken a different, it's kind of evolved over the last even just 5 years or so, because that used to mean, prior to full frame sensor digital cameras, that tended to mean I have this video shot that's like a 1/3-inch chip sensor, and it's like everything's sharp, the depth of field's almost infinite, and it might be even standard F video or whatnot, but it just looks video. And so a lot of that used to have, film looked softer, the depth of field was narrower, so it had a filmic look. It had film grain, obviously. But now a lot of digital cameras get that depth of field of film, so that's kind of not part of that equation. A lot of the times what looks digital to me, or the video quality that tends to look more off-putting, to me tends to be the harshness of the clipping. how the shadows fall out, and more importantly, how the highlights fall off. So a lot of times with film, it just has a natural soft clipping, where video / digital tends to be a harder kind of a clip. So, you watch broadcast television, say news or something, and that's like one extreme side of the spectrum where you'll see a lot of clippy whites, and that's just very typical traditional video look. And so what I'd like to do is I have some really pretty footage that I'm going to kind of do 2 passes on. One is more of I'll say the video look, which is going to be more, I'll say it more Discovery Channel, Planet Earth kind of thing. We're just going to make everything very saturated and bright, and just more of a docu video kind of a look. And then I'll do more of a feature film type look and just discuss the qualities that kind of make one feel right for one application and one feel right for another. So this footage is from Adelaide National Park in Australia. So this is all coming from a red camera. So what I'll do is let's kind of play through it for you guys. And this is the original footage. And I think this will kind of serve as a dual-purposed class here, because there was questions in the forums about the confusing nature of the R3D files and how all the different output LUT gamma settings and output color space settings can be confusing, and which settings do I use? Do I use the metadata settings that the DP set, or do I use the default, or which setting do I use? So what I'm going to try to explain here, and again, the default in this footage was Rec 709 gamma, and the color space was camera RGB. So what I'm going to do is actually each shot will have, I'm just going to choose different settings. So some will be red space, some will be red color, some will be red color 3, some will be red film log. I think one is going to be sRGB, and some will be just how the default is, or the metadata is camera RGB Rec 709. So I just want to demonstrate that, yes, the different settings give you different results and can be confusing on which to use, but at the end of the day, you can make all those different settings work together, because each shot I'm going to do a different look, different metadata setting. So that's the raw footage that you're looking at there. And so what I'm going to do now is just play through a graded version of it, where I obviously gave it a lot more color. Blue skies, red sand, some clippy whites, which some I pushed a little bit more just to demonstrate the difference between, say, a video look and more of a filmic look. So I would say this is more National Geographic-ish, Discovery Channel type of a look, where it's just beautiful footage, bright primary colors, open, rich blacks, and then the classic, you see this all the time now with the 5D, the time-lapse stuff, which is real beautiful stuff. So cool. So what I'm going to do is just kind of walk through some of these shots and just kind of tell you what I did to get to where I ended up. So this particular shot, I left the original camera settings at Rec 709 and camera RGB for the color space. And so, the image looks pretty bland, very desaturated and flat. So you'll see I do have a tech grade there, but it's set to, my gamma contrast is set to 1, which isn't doing anything. So because usually I have that in my stack when it's a log, when I switch it to red log film. So here in my base, I'm just adding a little bit of saturation just to give it some color and a little separation. And then from there, I built a few, I have a shape on the sand to give it a little bit of contrast and color. I have a shape on the middle background, just kind of isolating this area. And I have a vignette on the sky, because what I ended up doing was in my look layer, I'll bypass that stuff. This is where I added some contrast. So with I really pushed the gain, crunched the blacks with the lift, and just kind of stretched out the image. And you can see that background, because landscape stuff tends to be very highly dynamic. You know, there's a lot of shadow detail and highlight detail, and to stretch the contrast in the foreground and middle ground, I really clipped the background. So then upstream from that correction is where I put a sky vignette, and I recovered some of that detail. And then that middle foreground or back foreground, I felt like I wanted to put a little bit more warmth and color back there, and there's probably a little bit of a haze of blue or whatever, so it kind of washes out some of the color, so that's why I put that there. And I actually didn't use any curve on this. I just used my lift gamma gain for contrast. I put another little vignette in the skies to bring a little blue, a little density back there. And on my output layer, looks like I just desaturated a little bit. And cool. So then the next shot here, I actually had the settings on red space and red color. Actually, in my R3D strip. So these are kind of the old school, kind of the first red camera R3D files. Those are kind of the settings that were kind of out of the box. And you can see from the camera RGB Rec 709 to red space, red color, it's pretty much just doing that. So it's actually flattening out some detail in the sky, but it's a little bit more mid-tone contrast in the bush. So very subtle differences, but you can see it can make a big difference. So here, since the image was kind of flat, I actually did use my tech grade and just added a little contrast there, and I dropped the exposure down in my tech grade because it was so washed out. And then it didn't do anything in my base. My tech grade kind of acted as my base. And then in my look layer is where I kind of built up some contrast there. I used, again, lift gamma gain, and looks like I desaturated the sky a little bit because it was looking a little too fakey blue, and I dialed a little red out of the blue, kind of here to there. And then I built up a little bit of color and contrast in the sand with a shape in the foreground. Put a pretty heavy vignette up in the sky because it just felt a little kind of washed out. Again, didn't use a curve. On some other shots I use a curve just to change it up, and I will, on a few shots I'll kind of build from scratch what I did on a certain shot. And nothing in my output. Again, my output I use for soft clipping whites and blacks, maybe desaturate or a kind of a balance on the output just to do some tweaks, but I didn't do any on this shot. And I actually did not sharpen anything, even though I do have a sharpening strip on there. So you can kind of see, you know, just trying to match these two shots. And it's lit differently. The sand's a little more vibrant in the second shot, but they're close enough, and they're with different red input settings, and you can obviously get there pretty close. This shot is kind of that classic, as I was saying, the whites out here are a little clippier, and don't get me wrong, you could obviously in a telecine, when you scan film, you can easily clip out whites, but this tends to feel harder, and a little, you know, the lines and the trees back here just tend to feel a little more video, as they say. And once I get through this, I'll go through my film pass and kind of show you what I did there. So this one comes up here, so you can see how pretty nasty it actually looks with the original settings on there. And again, original settings Rec 709 for gamma, and color space was camera RGB. So here I use my standby settings that I typically use: red log film and red color 3. And then I use a tech grade to convert from linear or log to linear here. So I just added a little bit of warmth in the gamma, and then in the next layer, looks like I just took a little in the final, you can see just the way I isolated the trees. There's a little red, so I just pull a little red out of that. But on this particular shot is where I put an S curve in there, and then I colored through the curve. And again, you can, do I use that technique on every shot? I don't. And again, some colorists do the same thing on every they keep their workflow consistent, which is great because it's more predictable and whatnot. But I kind of just, every shot, it's usually per job based, but some shots feel like I can use the curve to my advantage, and sometimes I don't. This one I used a curve and colored through that, and I put a pretty heavy sky vignette up top with a nice feather on there to give a little bit of color to kind of match up these shots a little bit better. And as I mentioned earlier, this shot has a really nice, kind of even, nice blue sky. Looks very real. This shot, it does look a little bit more affected, but just for the sake of matching, I threw a little bit of blue up in that sky. And then in my output layer, you can see this is where I kind of clipped out those whites just to kind of give a little bit more of a video kind of look to it. But yeah, so you can see what we did there. Again, that just kind of flows, keeping that kind of red, blue sky, kind of a vibe going. Feels like the same world. And then, so this is a pretty cool shot. So what I'll do here is just kind of build this one from scratch. So this one starts here. So this one, I actually just kept the, actually I did switch this one. So this one I switched it to Red Gamma 2 and sRGB. So sRGB is actually fairly close to Rec 709. There's actually barely, a great way to kind of see what's going on between the different settings is to have your vector scope up there and kind of seeing if it's a saturation thing or your waveform if it's a contrast thing. So I will start over on this one. And again, this is just Red Gamma 2 and sRGB. Just for fun, let's switch output color space to Rec 709. So here, obviously really flat, so I'll bring my blacks down and drop the gamma a little bit, push the whites up. And just work the contrast that way. And so there's quite a bit of, again, dynamic range, a lot of detail throughout the shot. So sometimes it's fun just to kind of crush it down and see where it goes. So again, I'm warming up those whites. You can see how this is just resetting the white balance. So you can see the whites are going very blue, and just by doing that, that adds warmth to the whites there. And so now it's feeling a little too crushed, so I'm going to open it back up a little bit. And now here I'm just pulling a little warmth out of the midtones. So I want the mids to be a little cooler, and I want the warmth to kind of hit up in the highlights. Again, I'm just pushing a little bit more warmth into the highlights. And a thing I like to do is just play with the blues. I'll just go to my 6 vector, as they call it, and just skew around the blue. So let's just give it a little nice cyan, kind of a blue. You can even go. It's kind of fun to go a little bit more green whenever you're dealing with kind of red rock, and then that blue sky. It's nice complementary colors to kind of play with. So I'll keep it a little bit more on the green side of things, which is kind of fun. And that's all just in a primary based on the red file that came through there. Push the mids up, getting a little muddy, and then now that I kind of like what's going on the right side, the left side's feeling a little washy, so I'll put a shape in there. I kind of want that upper left to bottom left to feel the wrath of my vignette here, so we'll position that accordingly, and then just drop in. And again, do you use I'm going to go darker with it, do you use the whites, the mids, or the blacks to do that? I kind of want the highlights of those clouds to stay bright, so I'm not gonna drop the whites. I'm playing with the mids here, and even that maybe I want to keep the intensity of the white cloud, so I'm actually gonna reset my mid-tone density and just bring the blacks down a little bit. And you can see how the hue of the blue is starting to go more red. The whites are going more blue. So let's bring that down, feather it up. Then you can go in there and kind of skew the blues a little bit more green again. So maybe we'll just be not go crazy with it, because you don't want to screw up that nice sky. You want to keep it natural. So if I go too dense with it, it just starts to get funky looking. So I'm gonna just go subtle with it, just kind of here to here, which does enough to bring your eye up. So that's starting to look nice and pretty. So again, you got nice richness in the rocks. The greens are feeling okay. If I wanted to go crazy, I could do something with that. Let's just for fun, let's see what putting a little warmth in that left side, make it feel a little more. Make it feel a little more warmth, a little more sunny. So you can see just by turning on and off that left side, it kind of just gives the impression of the sun's over there. Maybe it feels later in the day. Here it feels more midday, noon. Here it feels a little bit later. So that's kind of fun. And cool. So you could have a lot of fun with these shots because they're really pretty. So so that's what I did before. So I would say my current self is more talented than my past self there, because I kind of like what I did live in class here. So again, that's a great technique, is just to do a pass the way it looks good, and then just delete, start over, and just see where you go with it, because sometimes it's just taking a fresh start is actually the way to go. Sometimes you can back yourself into a corner if you just kind of marry yourself to your first attempt at it. So I'm actually going to undo that warmth on the left, because I think it's not going to necessarily match what I've previously done in some other shots here. So that was getting a little too warm. So we'll just leave that be for the sake of matching. Cool. So shot's feeling nice, bright, and place you want to go on vacation. And so then, again, here's the next shot, and here's the original red file. Again, Rec 709 and camera RGB. This one, I just kept the whole thing, Rec 709 for all the settings. And again, in my base, here's the Rec 709 for both gamma and color space. In the base setting, I just added a little warmth. In my look, I added some contrast. The sky gets a little washed out. So what did I do on my next layer? Here, the dirt was going a little Martian kind of red, so I desaturated that. I colored this one through a curve, and you can see my curve here is a little funky. I gave it a little more of a mid boost. You can see where I kind of pushed open the mids a little bit to give a little bit of a boost there. Here, I opened up the foreground, because when you look at a shot, you kind of want to see what's the hero of this shot. It's like, well, the sky isn't really, because the trees are kind of in front of it. The mountains aren't because of the trees in front. So it's probably the red dirt is kind of the hero. So I added some contrast in there. I vignetted down the sky to kind of accentuate those clouds. I added a second vignette. You can see I doubled up 2 vignettes in the sky, and I doubled up 2 vignettes in the sand. That's okay as long as they're not muddying up each other. Sometimes if you add a second layer that's essentially doing the same thing as another layer, you can just delete one and start with that other one, or it's okay to kind of stack layers that are essentially doing the same thing. Just make sure they're not kind of hurting each other. Here I put a little vignette on the bottom corners and nothing in the output or sharpening layer, and that's kind of where I ended up. So you can see from the original to here, we're getting some nice detail out of these clouds, and that's by just adding some density, dropping the gamma on that particular vignette just to get something out of those clouds. And you can see I greened up the sky and that shit more cyan, so the sky feels a little more magenta here, but that's okay. We're not going to take it too literal. So here's the epic pan track shot there. So this one I'll build quickly from scratch as well, because I did some interesting things with the trees and the reflections in the water and in the sky. So I will start this one from scratch for you guys. So on this particular shot, I went a little crazy and went red log film for the gamma and red log film for the gamma and red log 2 for the color space. So not far off from where I typically go. So I might as well just keep that consistent when I build this one from scratch. So here is, let's see here, red log film, red color 2. So you can see what, so that's the original, and then what that change in gamma is doing to it, converting it to log. And then my tech grade is going to convert that back to linear. And you may think, what's the point? And to really set it to log, then convert it to linear right away. But the tech grade control essentially does a gamma shift where it takes the log out of it, makes it linear. But it's a nice tool for color balance. The exposure control is really nice. So to go into the R3D strip and adjust exposure or color balance can be kind of annoying or not very efficient. So the tech grade kind of helps me do a color balance and exposure adjustment, or even a contrast control, because there is a contrast adjustment there. So it's just a quick way to do some simple things that you'd have to go in and adjust knobs in the R3D strip. So that's that. So now I'm going to go to my base and I'm going to add a little bit of color saturation, because I really want to go all Moab on these rocks here. Go a little bit more red rocky with it. And add a little warmth in there. This is in my tech grade. Just adding a little warmth, which would essentially be, if you're using the R3D strip to set color balance, it would actually be your Kelvin or tint control, or you can even go into your RGB controls there. So that's kind of a nice place to start. So now I'm going to go into my look layer and start playing with some contrast. So I'm going to drop the blacks down, some nice rich shadows there. And you can see that there's not really much detail in the sky, so I'll deal with that later. Maybe I'll put a little vignette, a little blue up in there. But now you can see the blues are going kind of purpley also in the water, which is never looks good in my opinion. But so I'll just take my 6 vector and just kind of rotate the blue hue away from red. Just go a little bit more blue with it. So I'll crush the blacks down. I'm going to pull a little red out of the mids and add a little warmth to the highlights. So it's starting to feel kind of nice. It would be nice to see a little more tone in the water reflection, and I would assume it looks probably more overcasty, but we'll fake it like it's a blue sky day. So what I'd like to do is add a little bit of blue to this reflection here. drop down the whites a little bit and add a little cyany blue reflection here. And you want to be very careful with this, because this is where cheesy video looks can really run rampant here, because if you go too saturated with it, it's just going to look fake and crappy looking. So you want to just be subtle with it and just have a subtle touch with it, and keep in mind that it's essentially an effect, and you don't want to go too over the top with it. Blurring your edges on your mat can help give the impression of it being realistic too. So that's not too bad. And then I capitalize all my layers, so it's easier to see. I don't want to strain my eyes for lowercase there. That's why I'm doing that. And then I'll so I'm grabbing the trees, and I'll just kind of play with the trees. Sometimes when you're dealing with foliage, it's just kind of trial and error, swinging around. If you want to go greener with it, blue or green with it. If you want to go a little denser, I'm going to pull the density down in those trees. Whenever you pull a secondary, make sure to check. Say you pull it on the middle of the frame, or the end of the shot, like I did. Make sure to go to the heads of the shot and make sure that secondary doesn't, the green wasn't being isolated at the front of the shot. So you don't want it to have a noisy secondary because you didn't check the entire shot and make sure the isolation looks good. So actually, I kind of like. Actually, that looks better. So it's a little denser on those trees. Okay, and then I'll, again, this is going to be another soft touch on this sky, because it is kind of a clipped out sky, and there's really no detail there to really recover. So again, you could go really cheesy video on you, and it just doesn't look right. So you want to just be careful with how much you do. So what I'm going to do here is just bring the gain down a little bit, just to get a little more tone in those whites, and then just kind of subtly fill it in with a little blue. And I usually push it off frame and just feather it down. If you want, you can even drop an overall vignette up top, on top of that, just so it feels a little bit more natural. And I'm going to go back and I'll warm up the highlights a little bit more. So that's feeling, again, starting from here, we're obviously in a much better spot. It's still, I'm not super happy with the way that sky's looking. Some purplyness has been reintroduced to this area that I'm going to want to kind of pull out there. But obviously in a much better spot. So I'll save that and just see what I did before. So before my gamma was a little brighter. I wasn't quite I'm a little muddier, I'd say, than my original interpretation of the shot. But it's close, to get to here from where I am is just a little move of pushing the mids up, pushing the whites up a little bit, and then you can get a little closer, add a little more red in my blacks. So you can see I took 2 passes at it, and obviously one's a little different than the other. one's not that much better than the other, but I think I like what I did earlier. I went a little denser in the water. It still doesn't look super realistic, but it's nice. I'd rather have a little splash of color than nothing at all. So cool. So, and then again, here's the original. I did a red gamma 3 and a camera RGB on this one. Just a straight up saturation and some contrast primary on that. Just I put a little vignette at the bottom of the frame. I kind of amped up the greens just to give it a little interest. It's probably it's a little noisy up in here. I could probably finesse that a little bit better, but I took a little liberties and going a little hyper real with it for the fun of it. That shot looks pretty nice, and then it's probably my favorite shot. And you can see time lapses are very common, and you can set the correction at the front end, and then as the time lapse goes on, it gets really crunchy. So what I would suggest is put a ramp layer in there and just kind of ride it. I like the exposure and density there, so I'll set a keyframe, move it along to where it gets a little too dark, and then I'll open it up a little bit, move it along, move it up a little bit so there's a little something there, and then I'll let it fade from there. And so now there's a little smoother transition to the time lapse there. The foreground goes a little greener versus the red mountains, and I could probably finesse that, but that's the original on that one. So the sky gets much more dramatic, so it's kind of cool. So cool. So that what I would say would be the Discovery Channel pass, the more video pass, and so I think for fun, let's do a more feature film type look on the second pass on this stuff and give it more of a film look. And what I was saying is the more filmic, quote unquote, filmic look, the highlights tend to have a softer roll off. The blacks are dense and crunchy, but may have a softer roll off as well. And that's, again, in this day and age with full frame digital cameras, it's this depth of field issue is pretty much gone. So it's really just a aesthetic, a feel, and unfortunately that's going to probably fade away as time goes on. But what I decided to do on this pass was just kind of go, just for fun, is go more for a Book of Eli type look. So very desaturated, very contrasty and crunchy, and a little post-apocalyptic greenish hue in the sky where we can. I did more of a subtle feathered vignettes, opposed to going a little bit more composited, zoned, where I could probably go in there and put a little more custom vignette, but I just did more general kind of greener skies. But and so what's interesting is, I'll just play through this for you guys. And then kind of walk through what I did. So basically what all this, because I colored it the Discovery Channel look, and actually this Book of Eli type look is actually just thrown on top of that correction. So it really tells you that once you have everything lined up, like you say you do a scene or a sequence of shots and you get it all matching, looking nice the way you like it, now that everything's balanced, you can actually just throw an effect, a color correction look on top of that, and double that up and just copy and paste on in every shot. And you can, everything's going to feel pretty consistent because that effect, that look is actually based on a balanced shot that's already has the proper densities dialed in that you already did. So that's kind of fun. Once you have a scene all worked out, you can just throw push a look and have fun and just copy and paste on every shot underneath all your color corrections, and it'll apply for the most part and look pretty good. So it's a quick way to show a client a different approach after you've spent some time on making it look good together. So you can see there's our, now you can see how, like, whoa, that looks more video, and then this feels more filmic, has more mood to it. So basically what I did here is I'm using that concept also of pre-saturation. So what I did is I desaturated quite a bit prior to any kind of color balance I did. So I basically desaturated the previous Discovery Channel look about 70% from where it was, and just kind of, and then if you have a reference, say you like this kind of a look, kind of, is it a warmer? It's obviously very desaturated. Is it a warmer desaturated look? Is it a cooler? This is a warmer desaturated look, and so I have a lot more greens and foliages back there. So I already have this middle background layer, so I can kind of go in there if I wanted to and just kind of warm it up, and just kind of go pull some more of those greens out of it, and then I basically downstream of that desaturation, you can add a little balance, so it's kind of a wash kind of a thing. I did add a little bit of a curve, crunched it down with a curve, so the blacks didn't get too like hard clipped black. And then I added a little bit of that green up in the sky. And again, you can see in this image that green little blip in the middle is very zoned. So I just kind of did an overall. And I don't have any, I didn't soften any of the highlights because they're already kind of soft to begin with. So you can see just how very quickly you can actually get to these looks. You shouldn't look at a look and say, wow, how did they do that? That's insane. It's just take a look at it, take a piece of footage, and just kind of try to break it down into its basic density, tonal values, saturation. Is it more monochromatic like this or not? And you can get there, and it's probably a lot easier than you think. It's kind of like learning an instrument. When you hear a song, it sounds really hard, but once you actually start learning it, and you know the chords, you know the notes, you know the kind of the rhythmic pattern, it actually can be a lot easier than you think. So same thing with a lot of these shots. I just based it on the other correction, and just desaturated it quite a bit, added some warmth. Look at our reference, we're a little greener. And again, obviously the palette is a lot different, but since I already have a lot of these layers already built, I can kind of come up in here, and I don't have to start from scratch on a lot of this stuff. So it's, they're still much more monochromatic than I am here. So I just kind of sucked a little bit more color out of it. You can see now we're getting a little closer. And I put my green sky downstream of those desaturations because I don't want to desaturate my green sky once I get into a nice spot. I want to desaturate prior to that. So I just kind of put a little green up in the top left. My nuclear haze up in there. There's obviously more tone in the bottom of the frame, so I can maybe come back. I did have a vignette down there. I can maybe open that up a little bit more, obviously. A little different, but you can just see how the mood obviously has changed from here. Whoa, you see it and you're just like, wow. But at the time, it felt pretty good for what we were going for. And now we're going for post-apocalyptic feature film look. And the same piece of footage that started here now can go here and have a completely different mood. So now that we kind of established our kind of look and vibe, you can kind of see maybe those highlights are a little too video-y, clippy. Let's just drop them down a little bit. Just kind of soften that out a little bit. Maybe my green sky is a little too green. Again, here's a fun shot that we worked on from scratch prior, so you can see how this is like slaps you in the face with its technicolor-y kind of poppy blues and reds which look great in context, but now we're going for end of days look here. So, and it definitely has more of a filmic kind of a vibe to it. And it's hard to, I can describe it with soft roll off and highlights, but it's also kind of a mood. It's kind of a general thing. I want it to look more filmic. Funny story, I was talking to the local Kodak rep many years ago, and I just kind of was joking with him, saying how it's kind of funny. At the time, they were really arguing how much better film is versus HD, and I was like, yeah, clients never walk into my room and say, I want that video look, when they shoot film. Everybody comes in with their video and wants it to look like film, so it's just kind of, he was like, hey, I got to use that, so it was just kind of funny how it's used a lot, but, like Phoenix asked, like, what does that really mean? And typically it's just a quality. Film was typically higher budget production, so typically the footage did look better, but there was a depth of field thing, and video had a harder. Now it's pretty much just the clippiness of video, and harder video look is kind of what I see nowadays. So again, desaturate it quite a bit, but there's still, again, I'll pull up the scope. So you can, as black and white as that may seem, you can see on the scope here that there's still quite a bit of color. So, because that is black and white. So that's if client says, oh, we're really monochromatic, skew it down or crank it down to black and white, and then show them this is black and white, and then they'll say, oh, there's a lot of color there. So again, I desaturated in this layer quite a bit, add a little warmth, checked my reference there. This one actually is probably the closest that we've seen so far. And again, look at the reference, look at the vector scope, look at the waveform to see the characteristics of what you're trying to go for. I'm not compositing burnt out vehicles and signs in my mountain scene here, but you can see the overall tone and vibe is very similar. Here I did a little black softening in Baselight. Has a control for shadows that has a little bit fine. You can see it has a pivot point where I just kind of control the fall off of the blacks, and you really can only see it mostly in the shadows here. But I just didn't want this hard black. I wanted a softer black. So play with that concept, and you'll kind of get a sense of clippy whites versus non-clippy whites, and just what that kind of does. Just for fun, I'll clip out. This feels kind of video-y to me. So let's go down to our output layer and soften those whites. You can see it. The midtones are really stretched and ugly, but you can see how those whites look much creamier, softer, less video-y, as they say. So again, same deal here. Again, just super desaturated from what we did in our Discovery Channel look, and now we're in a much denser, kind of a cool look here. Threw a little green sky up there. And a little soft highlights. So again, there's not many layers going to get kind of pulling off that look. Here's our scene we built from scratch earlier. And coming from a place you'd want to go to a place maybe you wouldn't want to go. And again, just desaturation and a little warmth just to kind of dial it in to where I want, and you're kind of there. So you can see how we're kind of building this really fun post-apocalyptic look here, all based on the Discovery Channel look. So cool. So I want to thank Peppo, Phoenix, and Ali for the questions, and I hope I was able to demonstrate some different concepts that we've done in different classes, and had some fun with different footage and some different looks here. And Thanks everyone for watching, and we will see you in class 10 for the review of the challenge submissions. Until then, take it easy. Thanks.